All right, now we can continue with our Jewish journey through the book of Acts. Just a quick contextual reminder. We left Acts chapter 2 after the giving of the Ruach HaKodesh at Pentecost, at Shavuot, in the temple. We left with a report of the early church in Jerusalem. And Luke tells us that everyone kept feeling a sense of awe and many wonders and signs taking place for the apostles. I mentioned last week that there was a chart that demonstrated that throughout the entire book of Acts, the only signs and wonders that were performed were exclusively through the apostles or through the apostolic legates, those whom they delegated their authority to, in which case it's Stephen and Philip who are mentioned here. It's not something that is through and through for anybody in the church to be able to do. The signs and wonders were limited to the apostles. And we know that because when a sign and wonder was required and was requested, they searched out for an apostle. They had to wait for an apostle. There was no one in an individual congregation, for example, who could raise the dead. So I know that this chart is challenging to read, but it breaks down the miracle, the agent who performed the miracle, the result of that miracle, and of course the biblical reference. And we see that in every instance, the signs and wonders were performed for the purpose of authentication, the authentication of the apostolic message. So you backed up your message with a sign and wonder, and we see that whether it's Peter, whether it's Paul, or whether it is Barnabas, Stephen, Philip, or the 12 apostles themselves. It is for authentication, and in some instances, it's also for the purpose of indicating salvation. So, we also dealt with the Jerusalem church, members selling off various properties and putting into the common till, as was necessary. This is not socialism. This is not communism. It was a commonism. But the problem with it was that it only was able to survive as a viable structure for how to run your local community, your congregational community, as long as people had property in which they could sell. Because the poor, you'll always have with you. So the question is, what do you do when your wealthy members run out of property to sell, to contribute to the needs of the poor? What winds up happening is, of course, not everybody gets rich, but the entire community becomes impoverished, which is where we find the Jerusalem church in the second and third of the 2/3 of the book of Acts. The first third, they're doing okay, but then there comes a point where Jerusalem church is very impoverished and, in fact, will need to rely on the support of churches outside of Jerusalem, in fact, outside of Israel as well. But in these early halcyon days, day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, they took the meals together with sincerity and gladness of heart. So their lives were structured in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem congregation, structured around two locations. That was the temple for formal worship and instruction, large group instruction, and for fellowship, for koinonia, for community. There was the breaking of bread, eating common meals together. That's why it's so important for believers to eat together whenever we can. It's a relationship building activity. If you don't believe me, just try this experiment. It's harder to do in the age of COVID, But nonetheless, this is a tried and true experiment for when things are normal. When you are at McDonald's, Wendy's, Chick-fil-A, wherever you may be, just go to someone before you dig into your fries, or in Chick-fil-A's case, your waffle fries, before you've touched them, when it's right on your tray, and go to someone sitting in the restaurant and say, before I touch my fries, would you like to grab a few? It's a perfect stranger. Let's go. Would you like to grab a fry or two? Okay. Or even better, okay, when you see somebody who's got fries on their tray, you just go up to them and say, hey, you mind sharing a couple of those fries with me? They look delicious, right? And you're either going to run in horror or you're going to build a relationship. It's an interesting way to start a conversation. Well, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were saved. So the congregation in Jerusalem begins to grow from strength to strength because God is favoring them. And the community is not afraid of them. They're actually kind of in wonder, in awe of them. They have great favor. And that's where we find Peter and John now in chapter 3. We introduced the subject last time we were together. The regular attendance of the apostles, of the residents of Jerusalem, of the believers in the temple for the times of worship. And Peter and John happened to be going to the temple at the 9th hour, the hour of prayer. That's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Actually, technically, the sacrifice occurs at 2:30, the hour of prayer. The gathering in the afternoon, evening sacrifice, what it was called, 3 o'clock. So there they are on their way to the temple. And again, I want to remind you that there is, in the book of Acts, a continuity of Jewish customs and traditions for the early church. No one became a believer and said, thank God, now I can jettison all the customs and all the traditions that I and my family have participated in for centuries. No, they continued as faithful Jews. And there's no legalism police who are coming to them and saying, don't you know that it's inconsistent to maintain Jewish customs and traditions and believe in Jesus? Why don't you go and have a ham sandwich? The continuity was very, very important because remember, there is no difference between, there's no separation of church and state. For the early church, the first 7 years, perhaps as long as the first decade, the church was solely and completely composed of Jewish people. And so what they added to their Jewish lives was the understanding that Yeshua was the Messiah. And so their focus of worship became strengthened and had more depth and understanding than it did before, because the Messiah was at the center of their worship and understanding. But nonetheless, their Jewish practices remain their Jewish practices. So, man who had been lame from his mother's womb, being carried along, was lame for 40 years, for his whole life. 40 years old. Whom they set down every day at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful, in order to beg alms of those who are entering the temple. Very, very high value that the Jewish people, particularly in the days of the temple, set on charity, on support. So if you were a beggar, it was not because you were lazy, because the Jewish people also put high value on, if you're able to work and support yourself, get out there and do it. Nobody's on the government dole. No one is taking unemployment. Nobody is relying on the state to support them. The only way you would ever be a beggar is if there were no other options available to you. And it was the last thing anybody wanted to do. But if you had to, in other words, you were lame and you couldn't work, there was no shame in being a beggar, and the community would indeed support that. There was a very high value placed on charity. So here we have this individual, and he's been lame for 40 years. So he's got, I guess you would say, beggar seniority in the ability to reserve a really prime begging spot for himself. And so he's begging alms, and he's at the gate called Beautiful. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's still a lot of uncertainty as to where the gate called Beautiful was located. Most people place it on the eastern side of the temple complex, but exactly where in the complex, how far in to the complex, is a question. Some place it on the southern end, which was the main entrance to the temple. But if it's on the eastern end, some would place it at the Corinthian gate, which is the gate that opens up into the temple structure itself, proper one, the most innermost gate there. Not possible, because as a lame man, he would not have been allowed in, and that was where the Levites would stand on the stoop, on the steps, and they would chant their psalms. So there's no way that it was there. Some like to point to the eastern gate. That is the middle gate there that separates the court of the Gentiles from the rest of the inner temple complex. That's possible, because that gate certainly was a beauty. But again, I don't believe the beggar, because he was lame, because he was physically imperfect, would have been able to get past the main gate into the temple complex itself. So that leaves the Shushan gate, or the eastern gate. That's the outer gate there, as you can see. And while it is a challenging gate to get to, if you were staying, let's say, for example, if you're staying over the Mount of Olives, right, over in Bethany, for example, where the apostles stayed with Yeshua at the home of Mary, Martha, Lazarus, if you're coming from there, that would be the gate that you would go in. So that is a very distinct possibility. This is what it looks like today. Those of you who've been to Israel, the original gate area is way, way underneath that complex, but that is where the eastern gets blocked up now by brick for a variety of reasons, which one day we'll get into. On the western side, actually, is an interesting proposal. There was from the upper city. So if they were up on the upper city, like, for example, where the upper room was, and they were coming from that wealthy area, if that's where they were staying, Peter and John would have made their way down, and there was a nice archway and a beautiful staircase and a lovely gate there, which is proposed. That's a possibility. This, again, if you've been to Israel, so that's the model. This is what's left, okay? You can see the yellow and you can see the gray. That's what's left. That's what it looks like now, 2,000 years later. Or it could have been on the southern end, the gates, the double gate to the left. That would be the area, but that's a double gate, not a gate called Beautiful. There's nowhere in Scripture where the gate, nowhere in rabbinic literature where the gate is, any gates are called Beautiful. So that was obviously of its time, nothing recorded for us, so we're guessing. But those are the steps. If you've been to the southern steps of the Temple Mount, you recognize that area, and the double gate there is actually the rightmost, the double gate on the left, the rightmost gate is bifurcated, and you can see it right there with fill stones. Those are the same southern steps, and you see the original wall there is in green. but that's where the double gate would have been. Point being, the beggar is outside the temple at one of these gates, whichever one of those three, most likely the eastern one, was called Beautiful. That's all you need to know. Let's keep up with the story. When he saw Peter and John about to go into the temple, he began asking to receive alms. Peter, along with John, fixed his gaze on him and said, "Look at us." The man said, "Okay, you want me to look at you? If you're going to give me something, I'll look at you. You need attention? I'll pay attention. I got nowhere else to go. I'll look at you, Peter." And he began to give them attention, expecting to receive something from them, a little tit for tat. You need a little attention, I need a little tat, okay? I need a little kesef, a little money. But Peter said, "I don't possess silver and gold." I don't possess silver and gold. Peter, you are the head of the church. We know that the head of the church, the one who stands on the shoulders of Peter, that person has all the money there is. So much wealth, gold throne, beautiful robes. Well, Peter, 2,000 years ago, didn't have any of that stuff, okay? Let's just say that's a little bit of a contrast in the role of Peter today versus the role of Peter in the Bible. All right, so you don't have all the wealth of the Vatican, okay? So you're the vicar of Christ, okay? So your line hasn't made good yet, okay? Well, we know that the Jerusalem church, when there was a need, they sold things and they gave to support one another. So Peter and John would have run back home, called an emergency church meeting, and crafted a benevolence package for this guy, right? It's not what happens. There's no running. Peter's first response is not, okay, somebody's got his hand out. Let's dig into our benevolence fund and let's start distributing. No, the benevolence fund, such as it was only for members of the church and the community. At this point, the beggar is outside the community. There is no benevolence package for him. But what Peter has to give him will prove to be much better. I don't possess silver and gold. I'm not the Pope, and we don't have a big benevolence package for you. But what I have, I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ, or Yeshua HaMashiach, the Nazarene, walk. Now, to invoke the name of Yeshua is to call upon God himself. So when Peter says, in the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, this is not a magic incantation. This is not Peter's Hebrew equivalent of bibbidi bobbidi boo, which, by the way, is Hebrew for bibbidi bobbidi boo. It's not an incantation. It's not a magic formula. It's calling upon the intrinsic authority, not of Peter himself. He does not have the intrinsic authority to do any sign and wonder. It is only in the authority of Jesus that Peter can act. And in the intrinsic power of Jesus, in his authority, he does act. Because again, to invoke the name of Yeshua was, again, not to invoke a magic formula, but to call upon God himself. in the name of the Lord, in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, in the name of Jesus Christ, the Nazarene, in all his power, in all his authority, this is what I got to tell you. One word, walk. Apparently, the beggar must have hesitated, because the next verse tells us, seizing him by the right hand. Peter doesn't wait any longer than he has to. The guy doesn't move, so Peter says, okay, you're not going to initiate? I don't mind initiating. Seizing him by the right hand, his begging hand, outstretched. Peter, the fisherman, is built pretty nicely. He raised him up. It doesn't say that he schlepped him up. It doesn't say that he dragged him up. It doesn't say he did a fireman carry until this guy was able to get his sea legs. It simply says he pulled him up. He pulled them up. And to pull somebody up from the ground is a hard thing if there's no participation from the party being pulled up. So he seizes him by the right hand, and apparently, as he seizes him by the right hand and starts pulling, the beggar, the lame man, found strength in his legs to pull him up. Because a lame man, you pull him by the hand, down, reaching down about here, it's very difficult to get any kind of leverage. So the moment that Peter seizes his hand, maybe even the moment that Peter said, in the name of Yeshua, walk, the man was healed. So, seizing him by the right hand, he raised him up, and immediately his feet and ankles were strengthened. So it's not just his feet, and it's not just his ankles. Apparently the problem was down on the lower extremities of his legs. His feet, his ankles were strengthened. And with a leap, this is how I know he participated as well. With a leap, he stood upright. So you can see how this works. Peter, reaching down, begins to pull. The guy starts to participate, realizes his legs actually have some lift to them, and finishes the act of being raised up with a leap generated from his lower extremities, from his ankles and his feet and his calf muscles. And with a leap, he stood upright. He didn't pause. He didn't simply stand there. He didn't wobble. He leapt upright and immediately began to walk. And he walked with a purpose. Because as a lame man whose imperfection had disqualified him from worshiping in the formal worship of Israel within the temple, the gate that separated him from Israel's worship had always been an impediment to him. Wasn't allowed past the gate. But now that he no longer had that imperfection, he headed toward that gate, and through that gate, and entered the temple with Peter and John in tow, walking and leaping and praising God. This is no ordinary worshiper entering the temple with solemnity, entering the temple with the quietness of purpose. This guy is making a scene. So if you didn't see the moment where Peter pulls him up, and all of a sudden this guy who's been there 40 years, he's lame, who knows how long he's had this prime begging spot. Everybody knows this guy walking in and out of this particular gate of the temple. People would go every day to the temple in some instances. Familiar face. If they missed the moment that he was raised to his feet, they could not miss him entering the temple because he made a scene. He was audibly praising God and physically walking, and not just walking, he was leaping. I dare say, if one of us came into the congregation one Saturday morning and we not just walked into the facility, but we skipped or we leapt as we bounded around, we'd say, "Are you auditioning for Tigger? What's your deal?" But if you saw this man, you knew what his deal was, because he was praising God that he could stand. He was no longer lame. He no longer needed to beg. He had a hope and he had a future. 40 years suffering under debilitating circumstances, under helpless, literally helpless circumstances. I mean, how did the guy get to the gate every day? Someone had to take him. Somebody had to probably put him on a cart and wheel him. Somebody maybe had to carry him. Who knows how he got to the gate and how he finished his day and left the gate in a complete helpless state, a state dependent on others for financial support, a state of helplessness that most assuredly was defined by hopelessness. No hope, no future for a man who can't work, for a man who can't walk, a man dependent on the kindness and the charity of his brethren. Well, now he's walking and leaping and praising God, which reminds me, of course, of the verse in Isaiah that speaks prophetically of the moment in the future when the Messiah comes. And during this time, when the Messiah comes, at that time the lame will leap like a deer, and call this guy Prancer. And the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. The waters will break forth in the deserted streams in the Arava. So that which was barren, that which was desolate, will overflow with water. A life barren and desolate of hope will overflow with joy and exuberance and the very audible praise of God. And all the people, not some of the people, not most of the people, not a few of the people, all the people came there for the late afternoon hour of prayer, for that sacrifice, for that time of formal prayer there in the temple courts. All the people saw him walking and leaping and praising God. And they were taking note of him. They noticed, in other words, they recognized him. This is not just some nut who shows up, some eccentric who shows up to worship in the temple that day. They recognized him. The man they only saw heretofore in a horizontal position with his hand out, they now see in a vertical position with his hands raised to heaven. They're taking note of him as being the one who used to, because he's never going to sit there again, who used to sit at the beautiful gate of the temple to beg alms. And they were filled with wonder and amazement at what happened to him. How do you explain what you see and hear with your own eyes, with your own ears, this familiar character, every day, gate of beautiful, gate called beautiful, alms to the poor, And now he's upright. He's inside the temple, not outside the temple. The gate opened to him now. Access to formal worship, the formal worship of God, along with his brethren in Israel, is now, the access has been granted. And he's walking and he's leaping, he's praising God. And the people know that this is the one. And it fills them with wonder, with amazement at what had happened. How did this happen? The people, the crowd, begins to assemble, and they are curious. I'd be too. Natural. How did this happen? What is the explanation for what I see before my own eyes? While he was clinging to Peter and John, all the people ran together at them from the so-called portico of Solomon, full of amazement. So not only the people in the immediate vicinity in the court of the Gentiles, which is, as you know, the temple is a very large, it's the largest component of the Temple Mount complex, the court of the Gentiles. It's the outermost court, plenty of room. And so not only do the people around the gate, called Beautiful, see what happens to the guy as he comes in, but throughout the court of the Gentiles, anybody with an eyesight and with an earshot starts coming running. All the people, again, not some of the people, not a few of the people, not most of the people, all the people who could see who were there that day. They ran together to them of the so-called portico of Solomon, full of amazement. Everybody there, whether they were close or whether they're far and coming closer because they wanted to see what's going on, they're all in wonder, they're all in amazement. Winds up being several thousand people there that day. Makes sense. Temple courts could accommodate a couple tens of thousands of people at one time, no problem. The court of the Gentiles is that very large. If you look at the outer wall of the temple, court of the Gentiles is the first area inside. It's very, very large. On the north and on the south side, you have very large open courts, and the east and the west a little bit more narrow. But then you have what we're looking at. We're looking at the back of the temple, and the temple face east. So if we look at that colonnaded area on the far end of the temple, facing the front of the temple, that's what's called the temple, the portico of Solomon. That's where Yeshua used to teach. That's where Peter and John are going to be teaching. That's where the story takes us. That's where these events, the next event is going to happen, right there in the portico of Solomon, in that colonnaded area. This is a close-up area of the model. You can see on the south side is what's called the royal portico, or the royal stoa, and then you have the lovely portico of Solomon, that colonnaded area. And this is an idea of what it would have looked like, something like so. So let's get personal here. Let's investigate what we can take away from this particular passage before moving on next week to Peter. Now that he gets everybody's attention, he's going to be sharing the gospel. Again, signs and wonder, perfect example. The sign and wonder is set up first. The wonder is set up first, and that authenticates before Peter opens his mouth publicly to speak. It gets everyone's attention and gives him instant credibility. And that is going to work out quite well in the congregation's favor, the Jerusalem community's favor, as we'll see next time. But let's just pause and unpack this passage. In this helplessness, day after day, the lame man waited expectantly. And he was expecting to receive. Now, despite bearing the crippling weight of 4 decades worth of accumulated hopelessness, The very fact that he anticipated receiving charity indicated that hope was still alive in the midst of 4 decades of helplessness. Hope had not been crushed. The light of hope had not been extinguished from his life. He obviously had mitigated his expectations. What he hoped for was very humble, let's say. A coin is the sum total of his expectations. A couple of coins every day. But nonetheless, hope was still alive. He waited expectantly despite his helplessness. And today, some of us in this room, some of us watching remotely, may be feeling helpless. And some of us may feel oppressed in our helplessness with a hopelessness that's positively crippling. Helplessness is like that. It generally leads, given enough time, to a sense of hopelessness and abandonment. That this, whatever problems we are helpless about, will ever get fixed. And whatever light of hope once burned, given enough time feeling helpless and being helpless, not just feeling, truly being helpless, like the guy, wasn't fake, he wasn't fake it, it wasn't just his feelings, it really was reality, he was helpless. Given enough time, that helplessness can lead to a hopelessness. And you don't have to be a lame man from birth to feel crippled by one's hopelessness. If you are without hope, you are indeed spiritually, mentally, psychologically enfeebled, crippled, lame. Some of us are dealing right now with challenging physical circumstances, with pain, chronic, crippling, debilitating pain. Some of us dealing with other chronic health issues. Some of us dealing with disease, bum heart, a persistent cancer diagnosis that terrifies us to the very core of our being. Some of us wonder, what is that spot that showed? What is that lump? What is that growth? What is that pain? What is that ache? Where did it come from? How long have I actually had this? And am I ever going to take the courage to see a doctor, a medical professional about this? Some of us, our helplessness is not born from physical ailments, but from our relationships. An insecure marriage, a broken marriage. It's not that rare to see insecure marriages that somehow the stability begins to crumble and the foundation begins to crumble. And eventually it's so crumbly that the foundation of the marriage itself begins to break. We all start with a strong foundation of marriage and a stable platform on which to stand together. But sometimes over time, that platform begins to weaken, begins to become holy, not holy in the religious sense, but truly potholed, places that you can't walk. If you step there, oh, there's trouble. And so you watch your footing, and both of you watching, you wind up doing, and before you know it, in that whole platform that your marriage started with, there's only a little tiny area for each of you to stand on, and it's on opposite ends of the same platform that you used to stand together on. And then sometimes the whole foundation crumbles and it's a broken. And some of us dealing with marriage problems. Some of us have estranged family member or members. It's not unusual to have a brother who no longer talks to his sibling, or a couple of members of the family not talking to a couple of other members of the family. Something happened along the way where that family union fractured. A parent estranged from his child, a son, a daughter estranged from their mother, from their father. Many of us have estranged family members. Others of us simply have strange family members, but that's, we love them. But nonetheless, we wrestle with that. How can we ever join together and reunite that which had been for so long estranged? Some of us dealing not with family members or with health issues, but with just how to pay the bills. This has been particularly true in this past year, with so many of us out of work, so many of us having our employment shaken up, and our paychecks likewise shaken. The unpredictability of so many of our finances. And so many of us in our helplessness, our financial helplessness, we look to the government, we look to the man and say, oh, please, Uncle Sugar, won't you open the coffer? Won't you print some more money on our behalf? And Uncle Sugar so very, very graciously says, sure, here's $1,200 for you. Here's $400 for you. Here's $1,600 for you. And don't ask for any more, because we all know it takes at least 6 months to get anything. Anytime the government wants to give you anything, $1. And don't worry about the fact that our national treasury is building up an unsustainable debt level that we pass on, not just to our children, but we're passing on to our grandchildren. Of course, there's a way of solving that, and that's just to devalue the dollar, which means that those of us who have been saving for decades for our retirement, hoping for that magic number to be in that bank account, and our investments, and our IRAs, and our 401ks, our 403bs, waiting for that magical day that we have enough that we can retire and live off of our retirement. Well, the surprise will be on us if the dollar is devalued and we now need twice as much as what we saved for decades, because the dollar is simply not worth what it once was, because the government keeps printing money that it can't sustain. So we have unpredictable finances. We have massive unemployment. I know unemployment has struck us in this congregation hard. It's a gut punch. And that initial gut punch turns into chronic pain. You can understand at the beginning of a pandemic, oh, everything's shaken up, and temporarily I'm out of work. But what happens if your unemployment lingers? What happens if there's no vaccination and no solution and no jobs to solve the helplessness of your unemployed situation? Leads to helplessness and hopelessness. Some of us have jobs, but it's insufficient. Insufficient employment. Some of us, we don't have a problem with income. We have our jobs. Our jobs haven't gone away during this period of time. But some of us, during this year and this quarantine and the antisocial separation that we've been forced to encounter, and the wearing of masks that hide our faces from one another, and all of the marks in every store that we go into where we can see some community, stand here, and you stand 6 feet away, and you stand 6 feet more. And even in a place of public business, a grocery store, we fail to have community. And even when we're 6 feet away, at least we can see one another's beautiful smiles. Oh, wait, we can't. Because 2/3 of our faces are covered by masks, or double masks, or triple masks, or whatever latest nonsense Dr. Fascist has to say. So we're lonely. Many of us have quarantine fatigue. So tired. I remember it was just April. So we had only been separated from one another. We stopped public services middle of March, like everyone else did. And by the middle of April, within a month, there was one of our members who I had a long conversation with on the phone. Someone, it was a single woman. I said, I haven't been touched in over a month. I haven't had physical contact. Not a hug, not a hand on my shoulder, not a squeeze, not a handshake, not a bumping up against another human being. And it's already taking a toll on me. I'm so lonely. This quarantine is so distressing. Let's go back to that last slide, please. Let's go back to that last slide, if we could, please. Well, whether our issues are, thank you. Thank you very much. That's what I was looking for. Whether our issues are chronic health issues or relational issues or financial issues or interpersonal issues. Some of us may be dealing with social and political upheaval fatigue. The past few months have been draining, and it seems that for some of us, our future as a nation is not only uncertain, but is troubled. Our culture, the cancel culture. Some of us are feeling hopeless and helpless regarding what we feel may be an untrustworthy media. You're not imagining it, it's true. They are untrustworthy. Or a censorious social media. They are trying to cancel us. It's not paranoia when they're out to get you, right? They really are out to get us. Some of us feel disillusioned by injustice. And some of us, because we've prayed for these issues, our health and our loneliness and our finances and our employment and our government and our leadership and our nation, and haven't received the answers we asked for, we feel separated from God. Many of us feel like our prayers are hitting a ceiling. It's our ceiling, and not ascending into the heavens at all, and that it doesn't hear us. But I have to tell you that God is always there with us. God is always there with us. He is ever present during every moment, even our moments of deepest despair and hopelessness. God had not abandoned that lame man. He was with him for every moment of the 40 years that he was helpless. And God saw him, and he heard his cries. Even in moments of deepest despair and hopelessness, God is always with us. So just as Peter told the lame man 2,000 years ago, I say to you now, no matter what, the solution is to reach out to him. Reach out to our God in the midst of our helplessness, in the midst of our drowning in hopelessness. Reach out to him and rise up and walk.